Welcome back, everyone, to another deep dive. Today, we're heading down to Petrolina, Brazil, for a case that's tragic and, honestly, it's utterly captivating. It's the story of Beatriz Angélica Mota, a 7-year-old girl whose life was taken from her, and it was brutal.
You know, one of the things that makes this case so compelling is the setting. You've got this vibrant Children's Day celebration at Our Lady of Carmen College, October 10th, 2015. Families are out, kids are playing, just a joyous atmosphere. It's really the last place you'd expect something so horrific to happen.
Yeah, you're really painting a picture there. And it makes what actually happened all the more disturbing. So Beatriz is at the celebration, right, with her family. Then around 10:30 p.m., she vanishes.
And this wasn't just a simple case of a kid wandering off. The search for Beatriz, it just blew up. It became this frantic citywide effort. Sadly, though, just a little over an hour later, 11:15 p.m., they found her body in a storage room on the school grounds.
Oh, man. That discovery must have just sent shockwaves through the entire community. I've read the details surrounding her death were particularly gruesome.
Yeah, they were. Beatriz was stabbed multiple times. I mean, we're talking 42 wounds. This wasn't just a killing, this was rage. That level of violence, it just screamed premeditation. This wasn't some random heat-of-the-moment thing.
It's hard to even imagine that scene. It makes you wonder who could do something like that?
Yeah.
And why? So with the joy of that celebration just shattered, where did investigators even begin?
Well, initially it was chaos. You've got a crowded school event late at night, panic setting in, witnesses giving conflicting stories. It was just a nightmare scenario for any investigator. To make things worse, the school, it had no CCTV cameras. So trying to retrace Beatriz's steps or find potential suspects, it was severely limited.
No CCTV footage. That seems like a pretty big oversight, especially for a school hosting a big public event.
Yeah.
How much did that lack of security footage impact the investigation?
Oh, massively. Imagine trying to figure out the movements of hundreds of people in a school that big without any visual record. It was like trying to solve a puzzle with half the pieces missing. Investigators really had to lean on those eyewitness accounts, which, as we know, can be unreliable. Especially in a situation like that, so chaotic, so emotional. The lack of CCTV footage, it created this huge blind spot in the investigation. It made it so difficult to put together a clear timeline or even figure out who might have been near that storage room where Beatriz was found.
It's hard to even imagine trying to conduct an investigation under those circumstances. You mentioned the storage room. Was that somewhere students or staff would access often?
Not at all. It was rarely used, tucked away from the main areas of the school. This really suggested whoever did this, they knew the layout. It wasn't just some random opportunity. This was planned.
That's a chilling thought. So you have a potential premeditated murder, a lack of good leads, and a community just gripped by fear. What happened next?
Public pressure was immense. Beatriz's parents, Lucia Mota and Sandra Rommelton, they became tireless advocates. They refused to let their daughter's case be forgotten. They organized rallies, gave countless interviews. They kept Beatriz's story alive. They demanded justice.
It's amazing how resilient they were in the face of such unimaginable loss.
Yeah.
It really speaks volumes about their love for Beatriz and their determination. Did investigators have any forensic evidence to work with?
They did. They found fingerprints and DNA on the murder weapon, a large knife found near Beatriz's body. But initial searches in police databases, they didn't turn up any matches. It was a huge setback, especially for a community that was desperate for a break in the case.
It's just heartbreaking to think they had this potentially crucial evidence, but the technology at the time couldn't provide the answers they so desperately needed. Did investigators have any other leads or theories at this point?
There were some theories floating around, but nothing with any real evidence. Some people thought maybe it was someone with a grudge against the school or even a family member, but those theories fizzled out pretty quick. The investigation hit a dead end. And for years, the case just sat there, unsolved.
Years of agonizing uncertainty for Beatriz's family and that whole community. Must felt like they were trapped in a nightmare they couldn't wake up from.
Absolutely. The lack of answers, the inability to bring whoever did this to justice, it cast a long shadow over Petrolina. But, as we'll talk about later, hope wasn't entirely lost. Advances in forensic technology would eventually provide a major break in the case, although it took years for that breakthrough to come.
You know, it's amazing how sometimes advancements in technology can unlock these mysteries that have baffled investigators for years. But before we dive into that breakthrough, I'm kind of curious, about the aftermath of that initial investigation. Like, what kind of impact did this have on Petrolina, especially in terms of school safety?
Oh, this case was a huge wake-up call, not just for Petrolina, but for the whole country. People were just horrified that something so horrific could happen at a school event, a place that's supposed to be safe for kids. There was a lot of outrage over the lack of security at Our Lady of Carmen College, especially the fact they had no security cameras.
We mentioned earlier that the school didn't have any security cameras.
Yeah.
I mean, these days that's almost unheard of, especially for a large school hosting public events. Did Beatriz's case lead to any changes, in school safety regulations in Brazil?
Oh, absolutely. Beatriz's parents, they were instrumental in pushing for stricter safety standards in schools all over Brazil. They really raised awareness about how important security measures are, things like CCTV cameras, controlled access points, and better lighting on school grounds.
Wow. So their efforts really helped turn a tragedy into, a force for positive change. What specific improvements came about because of this case?
Well, after Beatriz's murder, there was this big push to make schools safer across the country. A lot of schools made CCTV installation mandatory, they upgraded their lighting, and they introduced these stricter access control procedures. The goal was to make sure only authorized people could get onto school property. There was also a lot more emphasis on training staff and students on safety protocols and emergency procedures.
It sounds like they took some really significant steps toward making a safer learning environment for kids. Did those new regulations face any resistance or challenges during implementation?
Well, yeah, any big change, especially one that involves upgrading infrastructure and increasing security, there's bound to be some pushback. Some schools, especially those in rural areas or with limited budgets, they struggled to meet the new requirements. There were also some concerns about privacy and the possibility of too much surveillance in schools. But overall, most people agreed that student safety had to be the top priority.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's good to hear that they actually took those steps to address those safety concerns that Beatriz's case highlighted. But let's shift gears a bit and talk about that breakthrough you mentioned. You said advancements in forensic technology eventually led investigators to a suspect. Tell me more about that.
Right. So you remember those fingerprints and DNA samples that were collected from the murder weapon back in 2015? Well, for years, they were a dead end. But as forensic technology advanced, especially DNA analysis, there were new possibilities. So in 2021, 6 years after the crime, investigators decided to take another look at the DNA evidence using some cutting-edge techniques that weren't around in 2015.
6 years is a long time to wait for a break. What sort of advancements made that re-examination possible?
Well, one of the big ones was the development of more sensitive DNA profiling. Back in 2015, they were mainly using a method called STR analysis, which needs a decent amount of DNA to generate a profile. But by 2021, there were newer methods like S&P analysis and next-generation sequencing, which allowed scientists to get information from even tiny or degraded DNA samples.
So basically, these new techniques gave investigators a more powerful way to look at that DNA evidence. Did that lead to a match?
It did. The more sensitive analysis produced a match to a guy named Marcelo da Silva. He was 40 years old and had a history of petty crime, but no apparent connection to Beatriz or her family. This was a big shock because investigators had been looking for someone with a personal link to the victim or the school.
Whoa, that's a twist. It's kind of strange to think that someone with no connection to the victim could commit such a brutal crime. Did this DNA match finally give investigators what they needed to solve this case?
It was a huge piece of the puzzle, yeah. It put Marcelo da Silva at the scene, but it didn't explain why he did it or give the full picture of what happened that night.
Sounds like they still had a lot of work to do. What happened next? Did they question him?
Yes, they did. In January of 2022, armed with this DNA evidence, they arrested Marcelo da Silva. But when they questioned him, his story kept changing. It was full of contradictions. He denied everything at first, but as they presented more evidence, his story started to fall apart.
So basically the evidence was piling up and he had to face it. What about his past? Did anything suggest he was capable of something like this?
This is where things get even more confusing. Marcelo da Silva did have a history of minor offenses like petty theft and assault, but nothing in his record pointed to this level of violence. There were no convictions for violent crimes, and people who knew him said he was pretty quiet, unassuming.
That's unsettling, to think that someone seemingly ordinary could be capable of such brutality.
Yeah.
I mean, really makes you question your assumptions about who is dangerous and who could do something like this. Did they find anything that could explain a motive?
That's the million-dollar question, and sadly, it's still mostly unanswered. Despite a lot of investigation and digging into Marcelo da Silva's background, there's no clear motive. No evidence of a grudge against Beatriz or her family, no prior link to the school, and no obvious financial gain from the crime.
So we're left with this possibility of a random act of violence, a horrible crime with no explanation. That's a lot to process, especially for those looking for some sense of order and justice.
Yeah, it challenges our basic ideas of cause and effect, that there's a reason for every action. But sometimes the reality is just way more disturbing. Sometimes the darkness inside people, it can manifest in ways that we just can't explain, and we end up with more questions than answers.
That's a heavy thought. I'm sure that's something that really resonated with the people in Petrolina as they were trying to come to terms with the arrest and the trial of Marcelo da Silva. I'm really interested to hear about how the community reacted to all of this and what happened during the trial. But before we get into that, let's just take a moment to reflect on everything we've discussed and the unsettling questions it brings up about, how unpredictable people can be. All right, we're back, ready to dive into the last chapter of the Beatriz Angélica Mota case. So Marcelo da Silva is behind bars. The DNA evidence is stacked against him. Everyone's attention turns to the courtroom. What was the vibe like during that trial?
Well, the trial started in early 2022, and it was a media frenzy. The whole nation was watching. It brought everything back to the surface, all the pain, the anger, the years of waiting for justice. The courtroom was packed. Spectators, journalists, and of course, Beatriz's parents. They sat through it all. You could see the grief and the determination on their faces.
I can't even imagine what that must have been like for them. To finally see the man accused of taking their daughter from them, facing a judge, it had to be a huge moment. So what was the prosecution's approach, their strategy?
They built their whole case around that DNA evidence. There was no denying it. They laid out all the scientific advancements that led to that match, and they portrayed Marcelo da Silva as this predator, just waiting for his chance to strike, hiding in plain sight at the celebration. They argued that the brutality, all those stab wounds, it showed rage. It showed he planned this. It was more than just a spur-of-the-moment thing.
So they were trying to prove premeditation, even though a clear motive was still missing. What did the defense do to counter that?
Oh man, they had a tough job with that DNA evidence staring them in the face. They tried to discredit the investigation, saying that mistakes were made when they were handling and analyzing the evidence. They also tried to paint Marcelo da Silva as this troubled guy with mental health problems, but ultimately someone who wasn't capable of something so horrible.
Feels like they were trying anything to create some doubt for the jury. Did they offer up any other theories, other possible suspects?
They did suggest maybe there was another person involved, someone who had a vendetta against the school or Beatriz's family, but they couldn't back it up. No real evidence, no solid alternative. Plus that DNA evidence, it made their job pretty much impossible.
Sounds like an uphill battle for the defense. What about the public? How did they react as the trial went on?
Public opinion was definitely on the side of the prosecution. The DNA and the sheer brutality of the crime, most people were convinced. They rallied behind Beatriz's parents, sending support and demanding a guilty verdict.
With all that pressure, all that evidence against him, how did Marcelo da Silva act during all of this?
He was mostly emotionless. No expression, nothing. He never admitted to it. His story kept changing, and that really didn't help him gain any sympathy.
So after all those years, the trial finally came to an end. What was the verdict?
On May 17th, 2022, the jury came back with a unanimous decision, guilty. Marcelo da Silva was convicted of murdering Beatriz Angélica Mota and sentenced to life in prison.
Wow. That must have been a complicated feeling for Beatriz's parents and the community. Justice, but it doesn't bring her back, and the questions linger.
It hit the nail on the head. There was a sense of closure, but it was definitely tinged with sadness, a huge sense of loss. The trial might be over, but the impact of what happened to Beatriz, it continues in the community and beyond.
We've really gone deep on this case, from that chaotic beginning of the investigation to the role those advancements in technology played, and ultimately, the conviction of Marcelo da Silva. But what about the lasting impact? What did this case mean for Brazilian society?
The Beatriz Angélica Mota case, it really showed everyone that even in places we think are safe, like schools, there are vulnerabilities. It started a conversation about child safety all across the country. It led to big improvements in security and just made everyone more aware of the need to be vigilant, to be proactive. But maybe the biggest legacy of this case is the work that Beatriz's parents have done and their foundation.
You're talking about the Institute of Beatriz Angélica Mota, right?
Yeah.
What's their mission? What kind of impact have they had?
That's right. Lucia Mota and Sandra Romelton, they started the Institute of Beatriz Angélica Mota because they were determined to honor their daughter and make sure this doesn't happen again. The foundation fights for better school safety standards. They help families who have been affected by violence, and they raise awareness about protecting children. They've been really effective at pushing for laws, organizing workshops, and creating a space for people to talk about these issues and do something.
It's truly inspiring to see them take their grief and turn it into something so positive, so impactful. They've made sure Beatrice's story, even though it came from such a dark place, continues to inspire hope and action.
It really shows the power of love and the fight for justice. They turned this unimaginable loss into a legacy of compassion and action. It reminds us that even when faced with darkness, we can still find ways to light the path toward a safer, more just world.
That's a powerful message. The Beatriz Angélica Mota case, as heartbreaking as it is, shows the strength of the human spirit and the importance of turning our pain into something meaningful. We've covered a lot in this deep dive: the investigation, the technology, the impact on Brazil. But as we wrap up, I want to leave our listeners with something to think about.
I'm listening. What's on your mind?
It's this. We may never completely understand the darkness that can live inside people, but we can choose to face it with courage, with compassion, and by never giving up on justice. The Beatriz Angélica Mota case reminds us that even in the face of tragedy, there's still hope, and that by working together, we can try to create a world where kids are safe, families are supported, and justice wins.
Well said. That really hits home. It reminds us that we all have a part to play in building a better future. By remembering Beatriz, honoring what she stood for, and tackling those big issues that lead to these tragedies, we can make her story a force for change, not just a reminder of what was lost.
And on that note, we're wrapping up our deep dive into the Beatriz Angélica Mota case. Thank you all for joining us on this journey. We hope this has not only been informative, but that it's inspired you to have these conversations, to take action, to create a safer and more just world for everyone.